Well, hello everybody. I'm sorry we have to do things this way, obviously, and so I always want to apologize about that. I want to try and make this as close to the actual classroom experience as I can, and so that's why we're going to film the lectures this way, just like we'd be in class. So we're going to do it as much as to be as much like it would be in class as I possibly can as we do this. So we got two kind of introductory lectures at the beginning of the class that we need to set up the rest of the class, and that's what we're going to talk about today. Is the first of the introductory lectures. We're going to talk about the history of psychology and introduce you to the fields of psychology today. That's our goal. So what is psychology? Well, psychology is the science of behavior and mental processes. And yeah, you should have your outlines out and fill in the outlines as I'm going through the slides here. So this is the first one that you should fill out about psychology. So psyche is the Greek word for mind, and ology means study of, and so the psychology means the study of the mind. Now, what we mean by science of behavior and mental processes is that the one thing that unites all the different fields of psychology is that the dependent variable, the variable that we're measuring during our studies, is always some animal's behavior. And so the animal's behavior might be like a rat pressing a bar, or it might be a student filling out a questionnaire, but regardless, we're always studying how some animal behaves. And you can think of psychology maybe as a subfield of zoology, is what I like to think of it as. So zoology is the study of animals, and psychology is the study of the behavior of animals. The second part is that it also studies mental processes, and what that means is we try and study what the steps are that are going on in the brain when you try to do a particular process. So that's what psychology is. Now, I know that when you ask the average person what psychology is or what a psychologist is, they think a psychologist is somebody who treats mentally ill people or maybe who helps people solve their personal problems. And that definitely is part of psychology. And the reason why people think that that's all of psychology is because if you don't go to a university, if you see a psychologist outside of a university, or if you see a psychologist in the movies or on TV, they're almost always a clinical or counseling psychologist. That's somebody who treats mentally ill people, or somebody who helps people with their, say, personal problems, marriage problems, for example. But as an academic field, that's just an itsy-bitsy, teeny-tiny part of what psychology actually is. If you look over the topics that we're going to discuss on the syllabus, you'll see there's only 2 lectures in the entire class that deal with mental illness and solving people's personal problems. So psychologists study the things that the brain does. Anything that the brain does is something that psychologists study. And so a lot of times what people will confuse psychology with is another field, which is psychiatry. What psychiatry is that's the study of the medical treatment of psychological disorders. And so a psychiatrist, in contrast to a psychologist, went to medical school and has a medical degree. And what a psychiatrist does is probably very similar to what a clinical psychologist does. The only difference between the two, they're both studying mental illness, but the difference between the two is that the psychiatrist went to medical school and can prescribe drugs. The psychologist went to graduate school, is not a medical doctor, and can't prescribe drugs. But you should think that psychiatry, as you can see, is really just an itsy-bitsy, teeny-tiny little part of psychology. Psychology studies everything the brain does. What psychiatry studies is just mental illness, and specifically how that's medically treated. Now, when I was a senior in college, I had a buddy of mine, and I told him that I was going to go to graduate school to become a psychologist. And he says, well, that's pretty stupid because psychiatrists are doctors and they make way more money than psychologists do, so you should become a psychiatrist. Well, problem is I want to study visual perception, and the only people that study visual perception are psychologists, not psychiatrists. So things that psychologists would study that a psychiatrist would never study are things like memory and attention and language and perception and attraction and persuasion. These are all the things that your brain does. The only thing that a psychiatrist is interested in is the medical treatment of mental illness. Okay, well now we've described what the field is. Let's talk about kind of the history of the field. So, psychology started as a branch of philosophy. The main distinction we're going to draw between philosophy and science is that philosophers come up with ideas about how a process might work, but they don't actually go out and collect data to see if the ideas are right or not. A scientist proposes ideas and then tries to collect data to test them. So before psychology was a science, it was just a branch of philosophy. The first people we have writing about psychology were the Greeks, and specifically, when we talk about Plato and his student Aristotle, they both wrote about psychology, but they didn't actually collect data to test their speculations. So let's start with Plato. He's one of the most famous philosophers in Western civilization, and he had several theories about psychology, some better than others. One thing he's associated with is emission theory. And emission theory was a theory of how vision worked. The Greeks realized that something had to pass between the world and your eyes for you to be able to perceive the world. And they had, different ideas about what that might be. Plato's idea was he'd seen like cats at night, and maybe you've seen this too, like if you flash a light at a cat at night, its eyes kind of glow. And so what Plato thought was that the cat had a fire inside of it, an inner fire, and it was shooting rays out of its eyes from this inner fire. They were gathering information out in the environment and then bringing it back to the cats, So that was the idea there. And so he thought that's how vision worked. That is, we don't have as good vision at night as the cats do, and so that's why we can't see our eyes glowing. But the idea is we got the same process going on. There's an inner fire inside of us, and it's shooting out the rays, kind of like Superman, bringing back information to our brain. Now, Plato was a smart guy, but this is not a very good theory, and I wonder if you can think of maybe why it's not a very good theory. There's something we ought to be able to do that we can't do if this theory were actually right. And so I'll give you a second to think about that. And so I would say the answer to that is, well, we ought to be able to see in the dark if this theory were right? Because what does it matter whether the lights are on or not if the way vision works is you shoot the fire out of your eyes and gather information and bring it back? Well, that should work in the dark as well as the light. And people brought this up to Plato, and so he had to, kind of say, well, for whatever reason, it only works when the lights are on. But really, he's just wrong about that. Okay. Now, another of his theories was he speculated on why all the sense organs pretty much are in the head. So you got your eyes, your nose, your mouth, your ears, all these kind of different sense organs are all right together in your head there. And so the question he speculated on is, why is that? And I'll let you think about that for a second too. Well, the answer he came up with was he thought that where they sent the output, like the information that they were getting from the environment, to the brain. And so they needed to be near the brain so they could have quick connections to the brain. That was his idea. And that one, he was absolutely right. That's right. So the reason probably why our brain is where it is and our sense organs are where they are is because it's advantageous to have your eyes as high in your body as possible. So you can, like if you're on a tall building, you can see a lot further than if you're way down on the ground, right? And so you can see further if your eyes are as high as possible on your body, so that's why the eyes are so high. Well, then you want the brain near the eyes so it can make quick connections, and then you want all the other sense organs to be near the brain so they can make quick connections too. So that's probably why our organs are where we are. Now, that was Plato's contributions. Aristotle, he did not think that the information from the senses went to the brain. Aristotle thought that the information from the senses went to your heart, and he had good evidence for that. When you see something scary, your heart beats faster, so it must be going to your heart. That was the idea. Well, he was wrong about that, and his professor was right. Plato was right on that one. The other thing Aristotle's famous for is coming up with the idea we have 5 senses. So the 5 senses in Aristotle are sight, hearing, smell, taste, and touch. Is that all of them? Touch, taste, smell, sight, and hearing. Yeah, those 5. Okay. But now, is he right about that? Well, let's think about this for a second. Let's say you had like some tortilla chips with some hot salsa on them, right? And you put the hot salsa in your mouth, and it feels hot in your mouth. Well, what's telling you that it's hot? I mean, is it taste? Is it smell that's telling you it's hot? Is it touch that's telling you it's hot? Well, it turns out, no, it's actually none of the above. There's an entirely separate sense called the trigeminal sense or the common chemical sense with its own set of receptors and its own nerve that projects to your brain that responds to chemical irritants like hot salsa or ammonia, or when you're cutting onions and your eyes cry. That's what's going on there. So he was definitely wrong. There are definitely more than 5 senses you've got up there. All right, the next philosopher we're going to talk about briefly is Rene Descartes, and he's famous primarily because he's sort of the villain in our story. So at the beginning of the Enlightenment, when a lot of the other fields of science were taking off, like physics and chemistry, Descartes made the distinction between the physical world that chemistry and physics studies, and that's subject to physical laws, and then the mental world, or the soul. And he said that the soul was not subject to physical laws. And so he was a dualist. He thought there was a difference between the body and the soul. The body could be studied, the soul could not. And so that's why he's kind of the villain in our story, is because since Descartes said that you couldn't study the soul or the brain, well, people didn't start to scientifically study it until much, much later. And so as a lot of the other sciences were progressing, psychology did not, because it was thought that you couldn't really study psychology scientifically. All right, well, that's the end of our philosophy section, and now we're going to start with the first group of people who actually tried to study psychology scientifically. And this school of thought was known as Structuralism. What the Structuralists are trying to do is they're trying to introspect, think about, as they're performing a process, about how that process works. That's how they're going to do what they're going to do. And it's really the first attempt to make psychology scientific. Guy we would associate with structuralism, but I'm not going to call him the founder, is Willhelm Wundt. Now, Willhelm Wundt is famous because he's considered the first scientific psychologist, and he started his psychology laboratory at Leipzig in Germany in 1879. And he didn't make a lot of big scientific contributions. His main contribution is that people from all over the world would come to his laboratory to study under him, and then they would go back to their home countries, and then they would start like the first psychology laboratories in their home countries after they got back. And so he's very famous because a lot of the people who started the first psychology lab in their countries were his students. Now, he was using the same research techniques as the structuralists, but he did not give it its name. The person who gave structuralism its name, and who I'm going to credit him for founding structuralism. Some people would say it should be Wundt, but since he came up with the name, we're going to credit Titchener. So Edward Titchener was the guy who came up with the term structuralism, and he was the first American psychologist. He opened the very first laboratory of psychology at Cornell University. Okay, so those were the first guys to study psychology. Now, how did this work? Well, structuralism tried to specify how psychological processes worked using introspection as the research technique. Now, what they were trying to do is come up with the actual steps that your brain is going through when it performs a psychological process. And the idea for how they were going to do that is they'd have somebody sit down and go through a particular process and write down the steps that were going on in their brain as they accomplished this process. The idea was you could have several people do this independently, and then you could look at their descriptions of the process, and if the descriptions matched, well, then you've got a pretty good evidence that something like what's going on in the description is going on. So let's take an example of this. Let's say we wanted to figure out what are the steps that are going on in your mind when you recite a poem from memory. So I think that I shall never see a poem as lovely as a tree. So let's say we're a structuralist. We want to figure out what's going on when somebody recites that poem from memory. We have somebody get a paper and pencil, sit down, and think about, all right, what's going on in your mind when you're doing this. So when you say, so the person might think, okay, first thing I'm going to do is get the first two words from my memory, I think. I'm going to send it down to my vocal cords to make the sounds I think. And then, as I'm saying in the middle of the second word, I think, in the middle of that, I'm going to go back to my memory and get two more words, that I, and then I'm going to send those down to my vocal cords and say those. And so that's how the process works. In the middle of the second word, I go back to my memory, get two more words, and then send them down to my vocal cords to say the word. Now the idea is that if we had several people doing this and they all came up with a similar description, specifically if they all said, yeah, I get two words out of my memory and I go back to my memory in the middle of the second word, well, then that would be pretty good evidence that something like that is going on in the brain, because independently everybody describes the process that way. And so that was a good way of starting out. That's probably how I would start out too if I didn't know anything about psychology, is just try to have people think about what's going on in their brains as they do this. But it turns out this is not a good way of studying psychology. The reason why it's a bad way is, number one, introspection does not replicate across individuals. That was key for this whole thing, is the whole process to work, is that separate individuals had to give you the same description, and nobody does. You get wildly different description of what is going on during the process from different people, and so there really wasn't any commonality. And the likely reason why there wasn't any commonality is reason B here, is that many psychological processes aren't open to introspection because you're not consciously aware of them. So you're only consciously aware of a tiny bit that's going on in your brain at any one time. Your brain's doing all sorts of things all the time to keep you alive. You're only aware of part of it. And so in the previous lecture, we did the subitizing demo, where I showed you the dots on the screen and told you not to count them, but sometimes you did count them if there were fewer than 5. Well, you don't know. I mean, you weren't aware of how that process is occurring. Something's happening, but it just boop, pops into your head that, yeah, I'm seeing 4 dots there or 3 dots there. You're not aware of the actual process that's going on in your mind that produced that in your head. So that's the problem, is most psychological processes can't be studied from introspection because they're going on subconsciously. You're not actually aware of them. All right, so that's why structuralism was not very successful as a school of psychology. The next school, in contrast to structuralism, is called functionalism. And structuralism was asking, like, how questions. How does this particular process occur? What are the steps in the process? That's not what functionalists were interested in. They were interested in why questions. So things like, why do people get angry? Why do people like to play games? Why can people see colors but dogs can't? Questions like that are the questions that the functionalists were interested in. Now, the person you associate with functionalism is William James, and William James is often called the greatest American psychologist. I'm not sure I'd agree with that, but he often is called that, and the reason was he founded functionalism, but he was like the last guy to have studied all of psychology before it kind of broke up into different subfields. So that's why he's famous, is because he was the last guy to study of all psychology, and he wrote this extremely influential book called The Principles of Psychology in 1890. The reason why this book is so influential is it's essentially a statement of everything that was known about psychology up to 1890 in every field. So it was the last attempt to really, I'd say, integrate the entire field in one book. And so the reason why it's famous now is because if you want to start a paper, you don't know how to start it, well, you can always look up in James' book, Principles of Psychology, what did William James think about this, and then start your paper that way. So that's why he's famous, is because he wrote this book. Now, the functionalists were very much influenced by Darwin's theory of evolution. And so they were asking questions like, let's take the question, why can humans see colors but dogs can't see colors? That's the kind of thing that they would ask. And so the approach they would take is they think, okay, what are differences between the way dogs live and the way humans live that would make it evolutionarily advantageous for humans to see colors but not dogs? I'll let you speculate that on us for a second. Think about their diets is what I would say. Okay, well, the likely reason humans can see colors but dogs can't is because humans eat fruit and dogs don't. And that really does distinguish among mammals. The animals that really have good color vision and the animals that have bad color vision is, are they a fruit eater? If they're a fruit eater, they have good color vision. And the reason is it's much easier to find the fruit on trees if you have good color vision. I'm colorblind, and the first time I realized I was colorblind is when everybody else I was with could see a bunch of apples on the apple trees that I couldn't see. And so it's certainly a disadvantage to finding fruit if you can't see color. And then also judging whether it's ripe or not, that's you need color vision to do that as well. So that is likely the reason why humans have color vision and dogs don't. And that's exactly the kind of explanation that functionalists would come up with when they're coming up with their explanations. So the functionalists speculated on what evolved functions a brain might have, but they're really philosophers. They did not test their explanations by collecting data. The structuralists who did collect data looked down on the functionalists. The structuralists said, we're scientists, we're trying to collect data. You are not scientists, you're not trying to collect data. And so really I don't think you can call functionalism a scientific school of psychology. They never did try and test their explanations. All right, so that's functionalism. All right, next one we're going to talk about is the first one you've probably heard of before, and this is psychoanalysis. And this is the first field within psychology. It's a field that's only interested in mental illness. So the psychoanalysts were only interested in mental illness. And their assumption was that mental illness is caused by subconscious conflicts that the person is not aware of. Most famous of the psychoanalysts, and maybe the only psychologist many people have heard of, is Sigmund Freud. He was a psychiatrist in Vienna, and based on his interactions with his patients, he came to the conclusion that the reason why people are mentally ill is because they have subconscious conflicts that they're trying to resolve, and that makes them mentally ill. And so you've probably heard of some of the stuff that Freud did. He is responsible, he thinks that the personality is tripartite. It's divided into three separate sections. The id, and the id is like your base desires, like your desire for food and water and for sex. It's kind of what you want to do is the id. And then there's the superego. The superego is like your knowledge of morality and what's the right thing to do in a particular situation. And then there's the ego, and the ego is the rational part of your brain that decides, are you going to do what the id wants you to do, or are you going to do what the superego wants you to do? Now, you probably heard of somebody saying that somebody else has a big ego, meaning they're arrogant or full of themselves. That's not how Freud was using the term. The way Freud used the term ego is kind of the rational part of you that makes the decision about what to do. And so you've probably seen cartoons that are kind of based on this idea. You've probably seen like the cartoon character. He's got a devil on one shoulder telling him what to do, and like the angel on the other shoulder telling him what to do. Well, the idea is that this comes from Freud. The devil is the id telling him what he would like to do, and the angel is the superego telling him what he ought to do, and then the person in the middle is the ego deciding whether to listen to the id or whether to listen to the superego. Freud also came up with the idea of the Oedipal complex or the electric complex. The Oedipal complex is the idea that if you're a male, that you want to kill your father and have sex with your mother, and the opposite, the electric complex for the female, is that you want to kill your mother and have sex with your father. You may have heard of that. That comes from Freud as well. Well, Freud isn't considered to be a scientist. He would be considered more of a philosopher because he tried to generalize based on his patients for what he thought was going on with them, but he never actually collected data in order to test whether his ideas were right or not. And I don't know, I got a student comment a few semesters ago saying they didn't like how I trashed on Freud. Well, I don't know if I'm trashing on him. If I brought Dr. Freud back here in a time machine and I said, Dr. Freud, I just told my class that you never actually collected any data to test your ideas, is that right? He'd go, yeah, okay. So he would agree with me on that. So I don't think I'm saying anything that's wrong. Now, Freud's ideas were extremely influential in psychiatry between like 1920 and 1970. If you see old movies on TV where like somebody's going into the psychiatrist's office and laying on a couch and the psychiatrist is asking them to tell them about their mother, often with a German accent. Tell me about your mother. They do that because the psychoanalysts were Austrians and had German accents. Well, they're making fun of Freudianism there. But I know that students, they hear about Freud and they must think that, yeah, if you major in psychology, you're going to have to learn all about Freud and read a bunch of books by Freud, and Freud is really, really important in psychology. No, he really isn't. I've never been assigned ever to read an entire book by Freud at any point in my education. And the only time I was assigned to read something by him was actually in a Western Civ class, not in a psychology class. So people think that Freud is influential on psychology, but no, he really hasn't, because there's no actual evidence that the things that he was saying were true. All right, so I promised we're going to take a 30-second break during each of these lectures, and I'm going to do it now. This is what I would do in class. And the idea is that you need some memory consolidation time, some time when you aren't hearing me talk and you can retain the information better. And so I want to keep up with that. I don't want to talk the whole time. So let's have a 30-second break here. Okay, let's get back into things. Let's talk about the next school of psychology. And the next school is behaviorism. I think behaviorism is arguably the most influential school during the course of the 20th century. Most psychologists were probably behaviorists. What behaviorism studies is the relationship between an animal's behavior and the reinforcement of that behavior. The idea is that animals interact with their environment, and sometimes they have good consequences associated with it, in which case they'll continue to do what they just did, or they might have bad consequences associated with what they just did. That's negative reinforcement, and so they'll be less likely to do that. So the idea of behaviorists is that our behavior is primarily driven by positive and negative interactions with the environment. So, for example, they'd say if there's a personality difference between people, let's say one person's introverted or kind of shy, another person's extroverted or more outgoing, well, a behaviorist would say the difference between the two is that the introverted person, when they were little, they had interaction with other people, and they had negative interactions, and so they learned that interacting with other people is a bad thing or negative thing, while the outgoing person, when they interacted with people when they were little, they had good interactions and it was a positive thing, and so they became more outgoing. So the idea is that as people interact with the environment, they're having good and bad consequences, and that's influencing their behavior. That's the idea behind behaviorism. The guy who started behaviorism is John Watson, is the person we associate with the beginnings of behaviorism. And he was famous. He took an extreme in the nature-nurture debate about which is more influential on behavior. He took an extreme nurture position. What he said was, you could give me a baby on the day it's born, and you tell me, what do you want to make this baby into? You want to make this baby into the world's greatest athlete? All right, I can do that. Here's what I'm going to do. Every time the baby does something athletic, like if it runs around or it throws something or exercises, I'm going to reward it. I'll give it a piece of candy and tell it what a good baby it is and praise the baby, give it positive reinforcement for athletic things. But if it tries to do something non-athletic, like tries to read a book or tries to paint a picture or does anything non-athletic, I'll smack the kid and tell him that's a bad thing to do. And so what will happen is it'll love to do athletic stuff, and this kid will hate to do non-athletic stuff. It'll spend all its time doing athletic stuff, and it'll become the world's greatest athlete. And I could do that with anything. You want me to make a baby the world's greatest businessman or the world's greatest poet? I could definitely do that. Or I could go the other way. I could make somebody the world's worst criminal in the history of the world as well, just through this process of reinforcing certain behaviors and punishing others. So they thought that the entirety of your personality was determined by these reinforcers from the environment. Now, the experiment he is famous for conducting is this experiment with little Albert. And everybody, every Psych 101 class has to talk about little Albert. So here's little Albert there. Little Albert's a baby, and Watson brought him into his lab. And there was a white rat in the lab that little Albert just loved. He loved to play with the white rat. And so when little Albert would come to the lab, they let him play with the white rat. Well, Watson, in order to show that everything was all your behavior was determined by reinforcement from the environment, what he did was a kind of unethical study where he waited one day while little Albert was playing with the rat, and he got an iron bar and a hammer, and he went right behind little Albert's ear, and as he was playing with the rat, boom! He hits the iron bar with the hammer. So this loud sound is in little Albert's ear while he's playing with the rat. Little Albert starts crying because it's so loud, and the rat runs away. The next day, little Albert's playing with the rat again. Boom! Same thing, right by its ear. And so now every time little Albert plays with the rat, he gets this loud sound by his ear. Well, pretty soon, little Albert comes to associate the rat with the loud sound. And so before, little Albert loved to play with the rat, but after he was conditioned with this negative reinforcement, the loud sound, he wouldn't play with the rat anymore. He was scared of the rat whenever he saw it. And in fact, not only was he scared of the rat, he was scared of anything that looked like the rat. So there was a neckerchief, what do I think? Muffler that was white like the rat, also in the lab. And when little Albert would see that, he would start crying as well. And so anything that looked like the rat, he also was afraid of. So the idea was, Watson said, well, this is how we come to our fears and the stuff we like and we dislike. It's just like little Albert. If it was something good, we had a good experience, we're more likely to do it in the future. Bad experience, we're less likely to do something in the future. Now, the most famous of the behaviorists, and probably I would say the most famous American psychologist, is B.F. Skinner. And so he's your classic behaviorist. He was interested in operant conditioning, and that's when an animal is interacting with its environment. How can you get that animal to behave in a particular way? And so he worked a lot with animals, particularly rats and pigeons, where they would be pressing bars and they get rewarded, they get food rewards for pressing the bar. And so he studied, the behaviorist studied all the different variables that can influence how much or how fast that the animal will press the bar, like how many times they have to press it before they get a reward, whether there's a variable reward or a fixed reward. That is, maybe sometimes you have to press it 8 times versus 2 as opposed to 5 times to get the reward. Whatever, every variable you can think of, they studied to see what affects how quickly rats can learn to press this bar. Now, the idea behind behaviorism is they thought structuralism had things all wrong, and the reason structuralism didn't work is because structuralism was trying to study unobservable things that are inside your head. And what the behaviorists said is, no, psychology can't be objective unless we study things we can actually observe. So the only thing we ought to be studying is, what did we do to this animal? What sort of reinforcement did we give the animal? And then what was the animal's behavior? We're not going to speculate on what happens between the two. And so in that way, we'll be able to make scientific psychology objective. And to some extent, I would say they were right about that. They came up with some of the very best and most explanatory theories in psychology. In fact, we know a lot about animal learning because of the behaviorists. They came up with many, many good theories for how animals learn things. So there are some behaviorists still around. Not very many of them, but some are still around. And I knew one when I was in graduate school. One of the professors at University of Minnesota was a behaviorist. His name was Travis Thompson. I'll tell you first what he does to make extra money. What he did to make extra money was he would hire himself out to people who had behavioral problems with their dogs. And so he would be able, if they were tearing up their furniture or barking at people, he would tell them exactly how to reward or punish the dog in order to get them to stop that behavior. Okay, here's the schedule you need to put them on, here's how you should reinforce them. And then if you wanted them to do like tricks or learn elaborate tricks, he could help you do that too, because he was one of the last of the behaviorists. He knew all their theories, and so he was super expert on animal learning. So that's what he did to make extra money. Now what he did professionally was he studied autistic kids, because autistic kids, they do stuff like they'll hit themselves, which is not good for them. And so he tries to develop ways to get them to not do that. And so it turns out that autistic kids will respond to a lot of the same negative and positive reinforcement that animals will. And so if you know a lot about how animals learn, you can help autistic kids to learn as well. Bizarrely, last semester I had one of the students in the class come up to me afterwards and say, wow, my brother's autistic and he works with Travis Thompson in Tennessee. He's in Tennessee now, and thought it was really cool that I mentioned him. So the behaviorists are still around today and they're still doing important stuff. So, yeah, that's the point here. Behaviorism was the dominant approach between 1940, definitely in 1960. I think we could go probably all the way to the 1970 if we wanted to. So in the middle part of the century, it was definitely the dominant approach to psychology, and they have really good theories of how animals behave. However, the popularity of behaviorism declined starting in the mid-60s, and then pretty much it was not very popular by, I'd say, 1975. And it's mainly because there's a lot of human behavior that behaviorists could not explain. There was a very famous book written called Syntactic Structures, and in a poll of psychologists for the most influential book in psychology of the 20th century, Syntactic Structures was named the most influential book. It was by a linguist at MIT named Noam Chomsky, who you may have heard of. He's famous now primarily as a political activist, but that's not how he initially became famous. He initially became famous because he was a linguistics professor at MIT. And what he pointed out was that there were things about language in particular that behaviorism was not and could not explain. So the standard explanation behaviorists had for how kids would learn a language is, the behaviorists would say, the way you're doing this is that the kid is doing imitation and reinforcement. So the kid will imitate what the parents do, and then if they do it well, the parents will reinforce them, and if they do it badly, the parents will tell them you did that badly, and through that process, you learn the language. So let's say you're saying words and you say dog, and mom and dad smile, yeah, you can say dog, and then you try and put words together and you say cat dog. Well, then mom and dad give you a dirty look and say, no, you're not allowed to say cat dog. You can't say cat dog. And so oh, I shouldn't say that. But if you say the dog, then they smile at you again. Yeah, you can say that. And so by this process of learning which words go together and which words don't go together, that's how the behaviorists explained language. That the kid's imitating the parents, and then they're getting rewarded or punished, and that's the way you learn language. Well, what Chomsky pointed out was, no, this can't possibly be the way the kids are learning language. And what he pointed out was something I bet you have observed if you've interacted with children very much, is that children don't just imitate the adults around them. Children will actually make up their own words. And the thing he used to illustrate this was the presence of irregular verbs in a language. Regular verb is one, all languages have a way to make past tense in the language. And in English, usually it's by adding ed onto the end. So talk goes to talked, walk goes to walked, and so forth, okay? And so kids will go through a period during their language development where they're trying to learn past tense, and they'll put the ed on every word because they have learned that that's how you make the past tense in English. But you also know that there are some words in English where they're irregular and you don't make the past tense that way. So go, the past tense of go is went, not goed, and the past tense of draw is drew, not drawed, right? But I bet if you've been talking to little kids and you ask them, for example, did you go to the bathroom? There'll be a particular stage in the kid's development where they say, I already goed. And if you're playing a card game with them, you say, did you draw a card? They'll say, I already drawed. I already drawed the card rather than I already drew. Now, they aren't getting these words from adults. Adults don't talk that way. Adults say the right thing. And what Chomsky pointed out is, no, kids aren't learning language by imitating and then being reinforced. Your brain comes into the world ready to learn a language. Specifically, every human language has a way to make past tense. Your brain has been set up to figure out how past tense is made in the language that you were exposed to when you were a baby. And so you go through a period in your development where your brain figures out, okay, this is the way we make past tense in this language. You add the ed, but it's before you've learned what all the exceptions are. So kids go and apply the rule to situations where it doesn't apply because their brain has been set up to figure out how language is learned in the world. And so all of learning, really, and human cognition generally, is not just due to reinforcement from the environment. Our brains have been set up to learn certain things like language before we're even born. And so behaviorism couldn't help people understand most of the mental processes that humans undergo because most of those processes don't involve punishment or reward. So the inability to explain language led to the downfall of behaviorism, I would say, even though they came up with a lot of good ideas. All right, so now what replaced behaviorism? What replaced behaviorism is the cognitive approach. And the cognitive approach is the dominant approach in psychology today. If I were going to come up with a theory in my field when I'm doing research, I would use the cognitive approach to do this. The cognitive approach is very much like what the structuralists wanted to do. You remember the structuralists? They were the ones who used introspection, and they wanted to go through the steps in the brain that you go through when you do a particular mental process. Well, that's what the cognitive approach is here, is the same thing. We're trying to figure out what the steps are in the brain as you go through a process, but we're actually going to come up with a different way to test those theories rather than introspection like the structuralists did. So essentially the cognitive approach studies how you take in information, how you store information in your brain, and how you retrieve information. Like I said, this is the dominant approach in psychology since maybe I would say 60s or 70s anyway. And it relies very heavily on the computer metaphor. That's what led to the cognitive approach. So the idea was like a computer takes input from the keyboard, right? And that has a central processing unit that like transforms the input, has a hard drive to store the information, and then it has a computer screen that will give you output based on what you put in. And so the idea is, well, your brain is the same way. It takes input from the senses, your eyes and your ears, and then you've got like stuff in your brain that processes the information, like the CPU on the computer, and then the output is some kind of behavior, either some action you take or some verbal response that you make. And so the idea is that the brain is very much like a computer, and we can study it the same way. So the idea is that if you're using the cognitive approach, you try and specify what the steps are that occur in the brain during a particular psychological process. And so let me give you an example of a theory like a cognitive psychologist might come up with. I'm not saying this is a right theory. I'm just saying this is an example of the sort of theory that the cognitive approach would take. So let's say we wanted to come up with a theory of how people recognize a letter. Let's say we got the letter P. What are the steps that go on in somebody's brain when they're recognizing the letter P? So how do they go from the output, the input, the actual letter P on the page, to saying that's a letter P? Okay, well, here is one possible explanation for what might be going on in the brain while you're doing that. So the first step would be to extract the edges. So we got like the long edge there and then the kind of curved edge in the upper right. So your brain would decide where the edges are in the environment. Second step is you determine which edges were straight and which are curved. So the one on the left side, the straight line is straight, and then the curved one is curved. So you label those as this one is a straight line, the other one's a curved line. Then you determine the relations between the straight and curved edges. So the curved edge, we would say, is below and to the, above and to the side of the midpoint of the straight edge. So that's the relations between them. Curved edge is above and to the side of the middle of the straight edge. And then you find the best match in memory. All right, is there any letter I know that's a curved edge that's above and to the side of a straight edge? Oh yeah, that's letter P. So you say letter P. So that's the idea, okay? Now, the idea is that we could actually test this, and here is a way we would test it, different than the way the structuralists did it. Remember, the structuralists had people introspect on what was going on, and then they saw if the introspections matched. Well, we wouldn't do it that way if we wanted to test this particular theory. The way I would do it is, I would use like step 2 there. Step 2 of this process says you determine which edges are straight and which ones are curved. And what we could do is we could manipulate that step maybe. What I would do to test this theory is I'd make up a bunch of different letters. Some of it had straight and curved edges. But for the curved edges, I don't know if you've ever thought about this, but it's possible for an edge to be really curved, like this edge is really curved like this. It's also possible for it just to be a little bit curved. So if I do it like this, that's a little bit curved. So this is really curved, that's a little bit curved. Okay, well, the clear prediction here is it should be a lot easier to tell that an edge is curved if it's really curved like this than if it's just a little bit curved like this. And so what I would do if I wanted to test the theory was make up a bunch of different letters, some of which had really, really curved edges where it was very clear they were curved, and some of which had less curved edges so it wasn't as clear. And then I'd flash them on the computer screen. I'd have a microphone and I'd have the person say the name of the letter as soon as they saw it. And the prediction here is, well, in step 2, if the edge is really curved, it should be faster to do step 2 than if it's just a little bit curved. And so the clear prediction, if this theory is correct, is that the letters with the really curved edges, you should be faster and more accurate to recognize them than the ones with the edges that aren't as curved. Now, if that result comes out, let's say that the curved edges really are easier to recognize than the less curved edges, then I would say, well, maybe my theory is right. It made a correct prediction, so my theory might be right. It doesn't prove that it's right, but it might be right. But on the other hand, if I did that study and I didn't find any difference, that is, it was just as easy to recognize the really curved letters as the less curved letters, well, that would probably falsify the theory. I'd have to say, nah, I don't think this theory is right, because the theory clearly makes the prediction from step 2 that the really curved letters should have been easier to recognize than the less curved letters, and they weren't. So that is how we would go about testing this theory in the laboratory. We could actually collect data to test it, okay? So this is the dominant approach, and this is what most psychologists do when they want to come up with theories. Now, the last approach I wanted to talk to about is relatively new, and this is the evolutionary approach. And really, this has only become popular since like the mid-1990s, but it's taking off in popularity here. This is very much like functionalism. The functionalists were interested in Darwin's theory of evolution, and they were interested in trying to explain animals' behavior in reference to evolution. How would this behavior help the animal to survive and reproduce? Well, evolutionary psychology is the same. They're tackling the same questions as the functionalists. So things like, why can animals see color, is something evolutionary psychologists would be interested in. But they try to propose their theories in such a way that you can actually empirically test them. You can go out and collect data to see if they're right or not. The evolutionary approach is controversial. It's only been popular since, I say, late 1980s, but really I think that was like the first book about it came out in the late 80s, but really only took off, I would say, in the mid-90s. The reason it's controversial is one of the things that evolutionary psychology is very interested in is sex differences. And so some people don't like the idea that there might be innate sex differences between men and women, but evolutionary psychology would say that there probably are. The evolutionary approach is similar to functionalism, but unlike functionalism, tries to create theories that are capable of being tested. That's the main difference. All right. So let me give you an example of an evolutionary psychology theory and a way that it was tested. One of the things, like I said, that evolutionary psychologists are really interested in is differences between men and women. What an evolutionary psychologist would say is that males and females participate differently in the reproductive process. And they would say the goal of all life, including human life, is to make copies of your genes and pass on as many copies of your genes as you possibly can. And they would say because men and women differ in how they pass along their genes, that leads to psychological differences between them. Let's start with a male. A male who wants to pass on his genes, well, a male can have essentially thousands of children potentially, and there in fact have been some males with thousands of children. Some kings of Siam and some sultans in Arabia have had in excess of 1,000 children. And so, because men can have essentially an unlimited number of children, if you're a male and wants to pass along your genes, the best thing you can do is have sex as frequently as possible with as many different women as possible. And as long as their wives or girlfriends aren't around, most men will admit, yep, that's exactly what they'd like to do. Okay, so that would be the best strategy for a male, is to have sex anytime it's available. On the other hand, a female is very different. A female cannot have an unlimited number of offspring. Probably in the environment in which we evolved, the average female would have 10 offspring during her lifetime, of which she could expect probably half or maybe fewer than half to actually survive in the harsh conditions that we lived in. And so there's never been a woman who's had thousands of children. Women are the limiting factor in reproduction, and so they only have a very limited number of opportunities to reproduce. Now, what that predicts is that a female is going to be very, very selective about whom she has sex with. Because she only has a few opportunities to reproduce, she's going to want to know that she's reproducing with a good mate and somebody who will stay around and take care of the children afterwards. And so the clear prediction from evolutionary theory is females should be a lot less interested in having sex with somebody they don't know than males should be. So they did a study to test this. The prediction from evolutionary theory is males should be more interested in casual sex, that is, sex with somebody they don't know, than females are. They did this study at the University of Hawaii, in which what they did was they got two Confederates. They got a really good-looking girl and a really good-looking guy to be their Confederates in this study. And we'll start with the really good-looking guy. What they would do is they would have choose somebody who was walking around on campus. This was done at the University of Hawaii. And they would have the good-looking guy approach them. And before they approached them, they were assigned to one of three conditions. Let me show you what we got here. So, yeah, sex differences in interest in casual sex. So for a third of them, the good-looking guy would approach this randomly selected girl walking around campus, and he would say to her this, and this is all he would say. he would say, "Hi, I've seen you around campus. I find you very attractive. I wonder if you would like to go on a date with me. Go on a date with me." When they asked that, 50% of the females said yes. Okay? Now, another third of the females in the study, the good-looking guy was assigned to a random female, and what he was supposed to say was he'd go up and say, "Hi, I've seen you around campus. I find you very attractive. Would you like to hang out at my apartment with me? Hang out at my apartment with me." When asked that, only 9% said yes to that. Okay. Now, another third were randomly assigned to a condition where the good-looking guy would approach them and say, "Hi, I find you very attractive. I wonder if you would like to have sex with me." And when he said that, 0%, none of the females said they would have sex with him under those circumstances. And in fact, it says right in the article, the most common response when the females were asked this was, "Are you crazy? Are you crazy?" That's what they said. All right. Well, now let's turn the tables. Now we got a really good-looking girl who approaches a randomly selected guy and tells him, "Hi, I've seen you around campus. I find you very attractive. Would you like to go on a date with me?" Also 50%. Well, they're not so different after all, are they? They're both at 50% there. All right, now some guys, the randomly selected the girl would come up, good-looking girl, and say, "Hi, find you very attractive. Would you like to hang out at my apartment with me?" Goes up to 69% there. Last condition, "Hi, I find you very attractive. Would you like to have sex with me?" 75% said yes. Okay? These are the biggest sex differences you're going to find. Not one of them said she was asked if she was crazy. Unlike the females, they're thinking, "This is the most sane woman I have ever met in my life." Okay? So the predictions from the evolutionary theory came out. In this case, males are a lot more interested in casual sex than females were. Now, I know when I talk about this study, a lot of people are upset because they think, wow, this seems like an incredibly unethical study for someone to do. Think about the poor guys in the condition where the girls come up to them and asked if if they want to have sex with her. What is the guy thinking? "Oh my God, this is the coolest thing that's ever happened to me. My self-esteem is just through the roof." And then she says, "Nah, it's just a psychology experiment. We're not really going to have sex." No, that's not fair. So that's a horribly unethical experiment. I don't think that would get through the ethics committee here. All right, let's take a 30-second break again after that. Let's finish off here. Well, what I want to finish off this lecture talking about is, we just talked about the different schools during the history of psychology. Let's finish talking about the different areas of psychology that are studied now and the sorts of things that each study. So, to begin with, let's talk about physiological psychology. Physiological psychologists are interested in the actual physical brain mechanisms in the brain that are responsible for a particular behavior. And so for each of these, I'll give you an example of the kind of thing somebody in this field would study. And so one of the things that the physiological psychologists study is pair bonding in the prairie vole and the mountain vole. I have pictures of the prairie vole and the mountain vole there. Vole is a fancy word for mouse. The prairie vole and the mountain vole are virtually genetically identical. They share far more than 99% of their DNA. Differences where they live. The mountain voles live in the mountains of central Colorado, and the prairie voles live on the prairies of eastern Colorado. And though they're virtually genetically identical, they differ in their behavior in one very interesting way. Mountain voles are very much like most other mammals. In most mammals, what happens is the male and the female mate, and then the male leaves and the female is left to care for the offspring. And that's how it works with the mountain vole. The male and female mate, the male leaves, and the female by herself cares for the offspring that they have. But the prairie voles, although they're virtually genetically identical, are very different in their behavior. What happens when the male and female prairie vole mate is they have sex 200 times over the course of a week. And then after doing that, they together build a nest for their offspring. And then together, both the male and female take care of the offspring in the nest. So we say they undergo pair bonding while the mountain voles do not. Now, the question is, these two species are virtually genetically identical. Why are they behaving so differently? Well, if you look at the nucleus accumbens of the prairie vole, this is part of the brain that controls sexual activity. What you're going to see is that the prairie vole has a large number of oxytocin receptors in the nucleus accumbens that the mountain vole does not. And oxytocin is a hormone that is implicated in pair bonding, in sexual behavior. After mammals have sex with one another, they release vasopressin and oxytocin, which starts the pair bonding process between the animals that have just had sex. And so what you find is with the prairie vole, if you take a female prairie vole and you take a male prairie vole she doesn't have any interest in, put them in a cage and then shoot up the female prairie vole with an oxytocin agonist. An agonist is a chemical that makes a neurotransmitter more effective. If you shoot them up with this agonist to make it more effective, she will begin initiating mating behavior with this male that previously she had no interest in. In other words, essentially, we've created a love potion for the prairie voles. We can make them fall in love. Now, as you're probably aware, we are one of the mammalian species that also undergoes pair bonding, and it's the same circuit in our brain that is the circuit in the prairie vole's brain that initiates that pair bonding, which leads to the obvious question, could we create a love potion for humans? Is such a thing theoretically possible? Could we put you in a room with super hot member of the opposite sex, shoot them up with an oxytocin agonist, and they will initiate mating behavior with you? It's intriguing, and I don't see any reason why it wouldn't work theoretically, but here's the problem. Any agonist that is powerful enough to induce you to fall in love with somebody else would also be powerful enough to probably cause schizophrenia in that person as well and make them mentally ill. Your brain is a lot more complicated than the prairie vole's brain, and so there's a lot more things that go wrong if we were to start messing with it. And so if we were to inject this oxytocin agonist in the member of the opposite sex, you would have a crazy person in love with you, and you probably don't want that. Yeah, so that's one of the things physiological psychologists would study. All right, next field is sensation and perception. People in the sensation and perception study how the nervous system receives and interprets information from the senses. This is my favorite area because this is what I study, and we'll be talking about it later in the class. But one thing that a perceptual psychologist might study is the conflict in your brain between the motion perception areas and the face perception areas of the brain. I'm going to drop out of my slideshow for a second here to show you this. So I'm going to show you this video of a Charlie Chaplin mask rotating around. And that's all it is just a Charlie Chaplin mask rotating around. Starting around. It doesn't change speed or lighting or anything else. It's just a Charlie Chaplin mask rotating around. Now at a certain point, as you watch this, your brain is going to freak out. And when your brain does freak out, I want you to remember, it's just a Charlie Chaplin mask rotating around. I haven't done anything to it. Probably right now is where you're freaking out. Yeah. All right. Yeah. Okay. Weird stuff. It looks like it started rotating the other way at a certain point in the rotation, and your brain couldn't handle it. I'm going to keep it going and try to explain what's going on here. So you got two different parts of your brain that are trying to figure out what's going on in this picture. One is the depth perception parts of your brain, and that's in your parietal lobes up here at the top of your head. That tells you where things are located. But then you've also got the face perception parts of your brain. These are in the right hemisphere near the occipital temporal junction. And these are interested in where somebody is looking at you from, or what somebody is looking at. And here's the thing. The face parts of your brain, they evolved in circumstances where the face was bulging out towards you. And so that's all they know. When the face is bulging away from you, like on the mask, and is rotating around, well, the shadows appear to be moving in the wrong direction for the way the face is moving, because your brain is assuming it's bulging out towards you. And so the only interpretation the face recognition parts of your brain can put on this picture is that it must be rotating in the opposite direction. And so your location parts of your brain in the parietal lobe are telling you that things moving one way. The face recognition areas in your occipital and temporal lobes are telling you it's moving the other way, and that's why your brain freaks out when you look at this. So that's what's going on. All right, so that's the sort of thing that somebody studying sensation and perception would study. All right, let's go back to our slideshow. Next area of psychology I wanted to talk about is cognitive psychology. Now, we talked about the cognitive approach before, and yeah, that's an approach to psychology that anybody could take. Physiological or sensation perception psychologists could take the cognitive approach, but cognitive psychology is also a subject area within psychology. And so specifically it studies attention, memory, language, and problem solving. Those are the typical things that are studied by cognitive psychologists. So they're interested in the steps that are going on in your brain while you're doing these processes. All right, well, one thing that a cognitive psychologist might study is the Stroop Effect. I'm going to do a demo with the Stroop Effect here, and we're going to do this 3 times. What we're going to do is all you have to do is you're going to name the color of the ink that's on this page. I don't know how well this is showing up. Sometimes this looks black, but this is blue here. This color is blue. So what we're going to do is we're going to go through. I'm going to point at each one. I'm going to try and go fast, and I'm going to do it too. I'm going to try and name each color, the color of the ink, as I go through. So try this along with me at home while you're trying this, okay? So here we go. Red, blue, yellow, red, blue, green. Yellow, green, blue, red, yellow, green. Okay? Pretty easy. I hope you found it easy too. So that's the first one. Now we're going to do another one here. Now we got words up here instead of patches, but again this task is the same. And again this is blue, not black. We're just going to name the color of the ink. Color of the ink. Okay, so ignore the word, color of the ink. Here we go. Blue, green, red, blue, yellow, green. Red, yellow, green, red, yellow, blue. All right, so that wasn't too hard either. I mean, a little bit harder than the last one, but still not too hard. All right, last one we're going to do. All right, so same thing. We're going to name the color of the ink, but now we got color words here. So again, ignore the word. That's not what we're doing. We're doing the color of the ink. So here we go. Red, yellow, green, yellow, blue, red, blue, green, red, blue, green, yellow. All right, that was hard for me. Better than I thought I would, but I bet it was hard for you too if you were at home. Now what's going on here? We're just naming the color of the ink. Why was this so hard and some of the others were so easy? Well, what's going on is this kind of shows you how your memory was organized and shows you the distinction between an automatic process and a controlled process. Remember in the first lecture I showed you the subitizing demo, and I showed you when you weren't supposed to count the dots, you couldn't help it, you counted them anyway. Well, that's an automatic process. It's something that occurs in your brain. You can't shut it off no matter how much you'd like to try. And after you've learned to read, and this is about after you're in 4th grade or so, reading becomes an automatic process, something you can't shut off. So when I just did the color patches without the words, that was the easiest. People can do that the fastest because they aren't getting any interference from the words, right? When I showed you the words that weren't color terms and you had to name the ink, well, that was a little bit harder because now you're getting some interference. The reading process wants to say the name of the word, but what you're supposed to do is say the name of the color of the ink, so there's a little bit of conflict between those two processes. But because color words are going to be stored in a different part of your brain than non-color words, it's still going to be pretty easy to say the color words and ignore the non-color words because of that. But what if I put it in the actual color words like in the last one? Well, now you've got one color word you're supposed to say. It's competing with another color word that's almost at the same location in your brain, and it's going to be very, very hard to distinguish which one you're supposed to say. So this shows us what's going on in your brain, how your memory is organized. Some things are going to be stored closer to one another than other things in your brain, and it's based on their meaning. Your memory is semantically organized, meaning that it's based on the meaning of the words. All right, so that's the sort of thing that cognitive psychology studies. That's the Stroop effect, that you get interference from words. All right, social psychology. Social psychology is interested in how people interact with one another. So like persuasion and attraction, these are things that social psychologists study. And social psychologists would be very interested in how culture, for example, affects your behavior. One of the more interesting social psychology studies that have been done in the last few years are a set of studies by these researchers at the University of Michigan, Nisbet and Cohen. What Nisbet and Cohen pointed out is if you look at pre-industrial societies, there are kind of two ways to make your living in pre-industrial societies. Some, before the Industrial Revolution, were farming societies. And farming societies tend to be very peaceful. If you're a farmer, you don't really have to worry about somebody stealing your assets. Your assets are in terms of land and crops, and you don't really have to worry about somebody coming in the night and harvesting all your crops and stealing them. And probably you're near some kind of central authority, like a police force, that if you did encounter some sort of crime, you would be able to go to the police force to handle it rather than handling it yourself. So they found that farming communities tend to be very peaceful communities. Now, in contrast, some societies make their living through herding because they live in areas where they can't do agriculture. So like the Bedouin tribesmen in Arabia, or the mountain men in the Rockies and the Appalachians, they primarily made their living by herding animals because the land they lived on wasn't suitable for agriculture. Now, if you're a herder, your assets are mainly in the terms of animals, a herd of animals. That is very easy to steal. Somebody could come and take all your animals very easily. You're also likely to be in a remote area in which you can't go to central authorities. When somebody steals from you, you're supposed to handle it yourself. And so in consequence, what you find is that herding societies tend to be very violent. Particularly, they tend to respond very violently in response to an insult. Someone insults you in a herding society and you don't do anything back, makes you look like you're soft. You're the sort of person that would be easy to steal from, and so people think they can steal from you. So you have to respond to an insult if you live in a herding society. Now, what Nisbet and Cohen thought was that this might explain cultural differences within the United States. The people who live in the northeastern United States, the part of the United States that was the Union during the Civil War, they were mainly settled by farmers from Germany and England and the British Isles. They're the main ones who settled that. And Nisbet and Cohen think they brought their kind of peaceful culture with them. In contrast, people from the southern United States, what I mean in the southeastern United States, the states that broke off and formed the Confederacy during the Civil War, those states were settled by Scots-Irish herdsmen who came over from Ireland. They were ethnically Scottish, but they came over from Ireland. And they brought that herding culture with them, where you're supposed to respond to an insult, or responding violently to an insult is expected. What they did was they did this study at the University of Michigan, where half their participants were students that had grown up in the northern United States and half had grown up in the southeastern United States and the Confederacy. What they would do is they tell the subjects that there's a particular room they're supposed to go to for a study. And they had a Confederate in the hallway outside this room, and they were like looking through this filing cabinet. And when the subject would come and try and pass around them to get to the room, the person with the filing cabinet would back up and bump into them, and then the person at the filing cabinet would call this person, the subject, an asshole. Okay? And as soon as they did that, boom, the researchers would run out of the room and immediately get a blood sample from the participant. And they also would ask the subject, how angry they were and how upset they were at that point as well. Now, the reason they were getting the blood sample is they were looking for the hormone cortisol. Cortisol gets released when you are under stress. And so if it bothered you being insulted, you would show a higher cortisol level. Well, what they found is that the southern students showed much higher cortisol levels than the northern students did, also reported being a lot more upset by the insult than the northern students did. And it wasn't that southern students in general have higher cortisol levels. No, if you measure them when they're not being insulted or not under stress, the cortisol levels of the northerners and southerners and how upset they are the same. It was specifically in response to an insult. The southerners got very upset and the northerners did not. And that's because in southern culture and herding culture, you're expected to respond violently to an insult. In northern culture, you're supposed to laugh it off. So that's the kind of thing that a social psychologist would study. The last area I wanted to talk about, and this is the one that you're probably familiar with, is counseling and clinical psychology. And these folks are the ones who treat mentally ill people and also help people with their personal problems, like marriage counseling, for example. Now, I bet when you were in high school, you had like a careers class you had to take that looked at different jobs. And usually as part of that, they have you either take the Cooter or the Strong interest inventories. I don't know if you remember that or not. But what those are tests that have been developed by psychologists. If you took those when you were in high school, they figure out with your set of interests what job that matches you up with best. And so there are lots of psychologists, these are career counseling, vocational counseling psychologists, that help people decide what would be the best career for them. They were based on psychological research. Okay? So that's an example of the different fields within psychology and something each one would study. And so that's it for this lecture. Thanks a bunch, and next lecture will be coming soon.